From the time of the Civil War up until World War I, traveling traders made their way through Appalachia, selling goods and services and buying farm and herbal products from those they met. Now, these traders, known as gypsies or travelers, were once a common sight. Hello, folks. I'm Steve Gilly, along with Rod Mullins, and this is Stories, A History of Appalachia.
Steve, when we talk about the gypsies, I don't know. I'm going to bring this up. This may cause a little bit of some feathers ruffled right here, but I think I was threatened sometimes with my mom talking about the gypsies. If I got out, gypsies would pick me up off the side of the road, and I'd never see home again because gypsies never stayed in the same spot. And then you saw all these television episodes back during especially the time I was growing up in the 70s. I think we saw something on Little House on the Prairie and Andy Griffith's show and different things like that. And gypsies were not exactly painted in a very positive, so to speak, light.
Well, the very term gypsy is also an insult.
Right,
that comes from the English thinking they were from Egypt. So Egyptians or gypsies, they call themselves Roma or Romani. And that's how we're going to refer to them for the most part on this episode of the podcast.
Okay.
Now, believe it or not, Roma came throughout Appalachia in the late part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. And they often traveled in a wagon train, which was said to be heard from miles away by the sound the wagon wheels made as they squeaked and groaned coming down the road, mainly because it was said due to their not being greased.
I can believe that.
Yeah. Now, these Roma had a leader, referred to as a king by those they traded with, and this Roma leader ruled the camp, and his word was law. He, for most times he was a man, was respected both in the camp and in the local communities through which the man passed.
Well, Steve, whenever a wagon train came into a small Appalachian community, they traded goods and services with the locals. Now, a lot of people wouldn't have any problem with that, but when they did, they engaged in good old-fashioned haggling to try to get the best possible deal. And there's a word that I would throw out there, Steve, but I'm not going to because it's kind of a derogatory term. But I've heard this word just about all of my life when it came to haggling about a price. And I'm sure that it probably got its origins somewhere here. Well, the wagon trains would come about every other year, and folks would go visit the gypsy camp to see what they had to offer. Among the things that folks were looking for in the trades were horses. I mean, hey, they brought in some of the best horses you could ever find anywhere. And, some of these horses are very rare, and some of them they still speak of today. But, that wasn't the only thing. The Roma were known, of course, to have traded for fine horses, and they brought those with them, but also pots and pans. The Roma liked to trade for medicinal herbs and roots from the mountains, and I can understand why.
Well, that was how they got their medicine back in those days. But everybody did. They didn't have drugstores and pharmacies, and if you wanted to go out and get a root or some plants or what have you for medicinal purposes, well, who better to point you in that direction than the folks that actually live there? And that's what they were actually trading for. But there was another unrelated service that the Roma traders brought to the isolated hollers around Appalachia, and that was news.
Yeah.
Now, it was difficult at those times to make it in and out of some of the more remote parts of the region, so news was scarce. But the wagon trains brought information from around the area to wherever they stopped, like a live traveling Facebook page, if you can imagine that.
Oh, the pain when you say that right there. No, I'm sorry. Well, that's what it was like. It's almost like having a party line is what we would refer to back in the 60s and 70s. So,
yeah, well, they were also known for wearing new, colorful clothing and flashy jewelry. Now, the Roma camps moved from place to place everywhere from Pennsylvania down to North Carolina.
Well, Steve, these wagon trains kept on rolling through, even through the Great Depression, with the groups getting poorer and poorer as time rolled on, due to nobody having any money, to buy any goods whatsoever. Eventually, the trains disappeared in the 1940s. Largely by that time, decent roads had made the isolation in the mountains much less severe, and the need to shop with traveling bands of traders offset by access to department stores in the nearby towns and cities. The Roma weren't the only group that wandered from place to place making a living trading with the locals, were they, Steve?
No, they weren't. Related to the traveling Roma were another group of itinerant traders known as the Irish Travellers. Now, these folks came from Ireland, obviously, late in the 19th century. And over there in the old country, they were known as traveling traders and as tinkers, from the Irish word tinkeri or tinsmith, from which we get the saying, not worth a tinker's dam. Now, a tinker's dam, if you don't know, folks, is something used to stop the flow of soldering material being used to close a hole in some tin work that they're doing. And a tinker, too, by the way, is the source of that term. I want to tinker about with something.
And I always wanted to say these bad things and stuff when I heard people say, and my dad was one of these people that went and he loved to tinker with stuff. He would go and he would get there with stuff. And I always heard that. And I thought, tinker, he likes to tinker around with stuff. And then he would throw that out at me and say, well, he tinkers around with all this stuff. So now I know where it came from. So.
Yeah, well, that name, by the way, Rod, is considered an insult to the travelers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, just like gypsies. Yeah. Travelers refer to themselves as minchieri, I think that's right, or pavis, or in Irish, the walking people.
Well, the travelers would move through Appalachia much as the gypsies did, going from place to place, trading goods and services, and repairing pots and pans and other household goods. In other words, tinkering with stuff. Okay. The travelers, like the gypsies with whom they intermingled, had their own unique language. Actually, they had two. One was a combination of Gaelic and English, along with Arabic and Romany, the gypsy tongue called Cant. The other is a Gaelic language called, I hope I get this right, Burla Regard.
I have no idea.
Well, I'm just making a guess at it. So, all right. They keep these languages to themselves and refuse to teach it to anyone outside the group, even to outsiders who marry into the travelers. And that kind of reminds me of something. Oh, gosh. You hear it sometimes in some of the lodges and some of the people like that. I know that it might have been mentioned at one time or another, the unspoken word or the unwritten word, so to speak.
Yeah.
That may have been it, but we're not exactly sure.
Well, speaking of intermarriage, the travelers have married into many marginalized groups in Appalachia, including Melungeons, Guineas from West Virginia and Kentucky, and the other folks in our story, the Roma. And they're also born storytellers, as well as entertainers and musicians. And speaking of stories, Rod, today we have a story that involved a group of these nomads, Roma gypsy in this case, in East Tennessee. Now, it seems that 2 days before Christmas in 1919, a Russian-born fortune teller and palm reader named Bonita Kerala found herself in a predicament. 5 months before, Ms. Kerala became involved with a group of Roma who had talked her into joining their group with promises that she would be wed to the son of their leader, the Gypsy King. Instead, according to Bonita, she was drugged and forced to help the group commit petty crimes such as theft and pickpocketing as they traveled through the hills of southern Appalachia. Well, when there was no wedding forthcoming, Bonita parted ways with Roma in Asheville, North Carolina. Oh, by the way, it didn't help that, according to her, the group threatened to sell her to another group of Roma, but they couldn't agree on a price. When she left, the head of the band offered to send her luggage on to Kingsport, Tennessee, and she allowed him to do so. She then boarded the train to Kingsport.
Once again, Steve, Asheville, North Carolina is the center of something else that's happened, and especially with these gypsies or the Roma. Okay. Well, unfortunately, this man sent the luggage in his name, not hers, and so the railroad refused to give it to her. She told the police that this was all of her possessions that she had in the world, and she was sure this was done so the man who sent it could come to Kingsport and claim it, stealing everything she had. And she insisted on remaining in town to protect her property and give the police time to investigate her claim to the luggage. She was given room and board by the city until that could happen.
Well, how about that?
Wow. And again, we're talking into this thing of the legends. I just remember my mom saying things like this, and they depicted people like this in kind of a bad light when they had them on television. I don't know if you remember the character actor that used to be in a lot of things back in the 60s and 70s. Vito Scotti. Do you remember him?
Yeah, I remember the name. I can't really place who he was, but I do remember
Okay.
the name.
Well, he was in some Gilligan's Island episodes, and then he
Uh-huh.
was also in some westerns. And if I recall correctly, I think he was in maybe an Andy Griffith show or something, and it had something to do with gypsies.
Oh,
And
okay.
he spoke in this, spoke in the sound, made it the mysterious kind of sound with it. But I remember him for some reason about that. And then I remember when they brought the women in, the women were mysterious looking, a lot of mascara, very beautiful, kind of a dark skin tone to them. Oh, it was something like, are you sure you really want to go and turn these people out and not have anything to do with them? Look here how pretty the women are. But it was, it's kind of weird back then. You kind of saw a bad side the way they presented them, but also a mysterious but a kind of sensual side, so to speak.
Well, I don't know that I'd pay a whole lot of attention to what you saw on TV and the movies
True,
because
that's
you
right.
know from our own experience as Appalachians
Hmm.
that stereotypes are all over the place.
Right.
So, 90% of this stuff probably didn't happen. This story that I found in the Kingsport Times News from the 1920s, all right,
Hmm.
I, I changed it around due to some words that were used in there. Let's put it that way.
Well,
So,
understandable.
there's a lot of stereotypes there. Now, are you aware of where the Roma actually came from?
Not right offhand. No.
Okay, think India,
Okay.
Northwest India, and they've done genetic studies that
Okay.
show that they all descend from a group of men and women from Northwest India. And apparently, there's a couple of stories, but one I've heard is that they were a group of warriors who brought their wives and children with them, and they were cut off from everybody else by the Persians, now Iran,
Hmm.
and they ended up wandering around for so long before they ended up in Europe. The other
Okay.
story I've heard comes out of Iran, Persia, where they
Hmm.
say that the king there, things were going so well that they wanted to help the poor people by getting them free music.
Hmm.
So he talks to the king of India, who sends a whole band of musicians to Persia,
Hmm.
where the king gives them land, gives them oxen, gives them donkeys, and gives them wheat seeds, thinking they can
Oh.
grow their own food and take care of themselves, and then all they have to do is go play music for the poor.
Hmm.
Well, they come back to him a year later. They're starving to death because they ate the oxen, they
Hmm.
ran the donkey off, and they ate the grain.
Yep.
So he got so upset that he banished them out of Persia, Iran,
Hmm.
and that set them off wandering. But either way, they did wander from the area of northwestern India across Asia, Eurasia, through what's now Ukraine and Russia, finally showing up in the Balkans, in Romania. That kind of makes sense. Roma, Romania,
Romania. Right.
in about the year 1000 to 1100, about 500 to 600 years after they left India. And
Hmm.
from there, they just spread westward.
Well, and another thing, and I know again, it's another stereotype, and
Hmm.
like you said, it's on television. But a lot of these, when they had them on television, they showed them, they were adorned with jewelry,
Hmm.
much jewelry and everything. I can remember the Vito Scotti actor that I was telling you about. He had looked like something silk. He was wearing for like a headband or a
Yeah.
headpiece or something that was kind of draped down this way, and then of course the earrings and looked like little gold medallions or doubloons or whatever you want to call them that were kind of decorated around on the scarf itself. I can just remember certain things like that, but they say they're completely different. At least the perception, like you said, and what they really were. So I'm sure there was some jewelry involved in there, but yeah, the haggling part that we talked about earlier, yes, that was definitely one of the true characteristics. That was one of the things that they did back then. And I guess you could say that some Appalachians have learned how to haggle quite well themselves.
Well, I think that's also an Eastern European thing.
True.
A lot of haggling trying to get the best price that you possibly can get.
Mm-hmm.
Well, folks, that's the story of the Roma and the Irish Travelers, two groups that once traveled throughout Appalachia, bartering with the folks they met there. Just another bit of the history of this place we call home, Appalachia. Thanks for listening. Now, you can subscribe to the Stories podcast in many, many different ways. Apple Podcast, Stitcher, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Radio Public, Amazon Music, and many, many more. And as you can see, if you're watching us on YouTube, we're on YouTube. So please go down there and click that subscribe button and give us a like if you don't care. Well, till next we meet, y'all take care. So long, everybody.
So long.